Welcome to the Good Sounds podcast. I'm Lauren, and today I'm talking with John Stuart Reid, a world-renowned acoustic scientist and expert in cymatics, the study of visible sound. His research reveals how vibration holds the powerful keys to healing. We'll be breaking down what cymatics is, how his invention, the Cymascope, works, and what this could mean for sound therapists and mainstream medicine. John, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while now.
Me too, absolutely. I would love to kick off with your origin story.
Well, that's a long story, but I'll keep it as short as possible, Lauren, because we've got a lot of material to cover. So,
Yeah.
well, as a child, I was fascinated by sound. After university, I decided to found my own business in acoustics. And
Yeah.
so it was a natural direction for me. And then that acoustics business spanned 30 straight years. It was during the last couple of years in acoustics business that my dad and I were traveling in Egypt because we were both fascinated by the ancient Egyptians and what they had achieved engineering wise and in every way, actually. And so as a
Yeah.
hobby, we traveled together in Egypt many times. And it was the early 1996 visit to the Great Pyramid, which was so life-changing. And it was one very simple experience that I had concerning lying in the sarcophagus of the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. And we had been in that chamber before, but usually, Lauren, it was always with a gaggle of tourists making a lot of noise. Fortunately, on this occasion in early 1996, we were all alone. There was no one else there. And so here we were left, alone. And it was really wonderful because then we could really sense the spirit of that sacred space, or all the spaces actually inside the Great Pyramid. So I did something a little bit naughty, but I'd always wanted to do it, which was to lie in the sarcophagus and make sound. As an acoustics engineer, I was fascinated by the resonant properties of that sarcophagus. And here, let me just define for you resonance as opposed to reverberance, because a lot of people get mixed up between these two terms. Reverberance is the term that we would describe, say, of our bathroom at home. You know, that sense where the hard surfaces reflect sound very well, and also the fact that a bathroom is, relatively small room, small chamber. And what that means is that specific frequencies of sound bounce really well off the walls, and what's termed the wavelength of the sound can sometimes fit exactly between the parallel walls, say, of your bathroom. And the result of this is that you're receiving reflections back to your ears that are coming at different times as they reflect off different surfaces. And that it's like a kind of an echo effect, but it's not a full, you never hear your full word coming back to you, do you? There's not enough time for that to happen. You
Yeah.
hear little reflections, and your brain, your ear brain mechanism senses these different timings and gives you that wonderful sense of space. That is reverberance, but don't get mixed up with the term resonance. What resonance is when an object absorbs energy to such a degree that it moves a little bit. It has to move in order for us to use that term resonance. So in the case of the King's Chamber, when you walk in there, you immediately, as soon as you make any sound at all, your own vocal sound or any other sound, like your footstep or anything, you immediately get that sense of reverberance and of space. It's
Wow.
as if it's a large area. In fact, it's actually quite a small chamber, but it feels large because of that reverberance. But now let's talk about the sarcophagus. This granite box, it's 3.7 tons of pinky colored granite, rose granite from Aswan. And it contains about 20% of quartz crystal in the matrix of this granite. And that makes it extremely resonant. What that means is that when you make sound in the chamber, most of that acoustic energy becomes directly coupled, acoustically coupled, into the sarcophagus. And literally, if you were to strike the side of the sarcophagus with your fist, which I have done, again, it's a little bit naughty, but it doesn't really damage the sarcophagus. But anyway, when you do that, it rings like a low-pitched bell. It has this wonderful, rich, low-pitched sound. And the sound that it's making is not a pure frequency. It's an array of different frequencies, making it a complex sound and beautiful on the ears, actually. So,
Wow.
knowing that in advance, I actually wanted to lie in the sarcophagus and make sound. That was the event that really changed my life forever. Because when I made this vocal glissando, this kind of smooth, unstepped enunciation of a single tone, what happened was at one particular vocal pitch, it felt like every cell in my body was tingling and goosebumps broke out all over my flesh.
Crazy.
It was an amazing sensation. And what I did was to play with that particular, what I came to call the Goldilocks pitch, just play with it a little bit. So I would lift my pitch above it and the effect in my body would did disappear. And then when I brought my pitch below it, again, the effect disappeared. And all this time, by the way, my daddy is standing there, just watching and listening very, very quietly. And anyway, I was fascinated by this effect. And the idea popped into my mind that this felt as if it had been
Mm.
designed in to the sarcophagus, that it wasn't a happenstance, but it was actually a design of the ancient Egyptians for a specific purpose. And so, anyway, at that point, this didn't last very long, by the way, only talking about, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes or something. At this point, I heard the Gafir, the guardian of the pyramid, coming up the grand gallery toward, where we were in the king's chamber, making a lot of noise. He was shouting at someone. And then just before he came into the chamber, I leapt out, leapt out of the sarcophagus, and he came in and he was pointing to his watch, and I didn't understand his words, but it was pretty clear that our time was up and he wanted us to get out.
Can I just ask, at that point, had you had any experiences with sound healing? Did you have any knowledge at all that sound could be used as a healing modality?
Well, I had read some aspects of sound as a therapy for sure, but I hadn't actually, because I was running an acoustics business, which was mainstream, and mainstream acoustics, there's no connection whatever with sound therapy. So no, I hadn't actually any direct experience. I knew of the general principles, but
Yeah.
never having actually been, directly involved with it at that point. When you're running a
Wow.
business, well, it's very, very focused basically on whatever the subject of the business is. And certainly didn't include sound as a therapy for sure. So anyway, what happened was at that moment, really, the idea formed, crystallized in my mind that I needed to go back to the pyramid with instrumentation to be able to understand this effect, to look into this effect with some proper instrumentation. So I managed to do just that. When I got back to the UK, I contacted the Egyptian authorities. And in those days, it was much easier to gain permission to
I
do
can
that
imagine.
work than it is today.
Mm.
Anyway, I did manage to gain permission, and I returned to the pyramid in the same year, later in 1996, and I carried out a long series of pretty standard acoustics experiments. And one of them I'd like to briefly share with you, if I may now, because it was
Please do.
extraordinary. Now, instead of lying in the sarcophagus to make sound, I placed a small speaker there. So now I could make sound from that speaker from an electronic oscillator, just making pure tones, right?
Mm.
And the idea was to map the resonances in that sarcophagus because, as I said earlier, the sound that it makes is complex. So to be able to map that, it was obviously going to need acoustics instrumentation. So the speaker
Mm.
would make the sound instead of me lying there. The speaker would make the sound,
Mm.
And then I also have what's termed a measurement microphone. This is a special kind of microphone that's calibrated, so it's very, very accurate. So the speaker would make the sound, and then the sarcophagus would resonate with that sound, making a complex sound. And then the measurement microphone would pick up those sounds and send them to a spectrum analyzer where I would be able to literally see a graph of those sounds, right? And be able to understand the resonant properties. That was essentially the experiment, or one of the experiments. But what happened was one particular frequency from the oscillator making this pure tone, the sarcophagus became extremely excited. What I mean by that is it started to resonate very powerfully, and the sound level rose very, very rapidly at that point. So I was putting in a particular sound pressure from the speaker, but now suddenly the volume of the sound, the loudness, increased significantly. And this showed me that the resonant properties of the sarcophagus were now really being maximally excited. So the whole sarcophagus was vibrating, in other words, right? And the antiquities inspector looked across at me. I think he was in the chamber the whole time, just making sure that all was well. And I think he was a little bit concerned at this point because of the sheer power of the sound. It was so powerful. Anyway, then
Amazing.
what happened was an amazing event. As I increased the frequency from this particular frequency that I was creating, I just increased it just a few hertz above, and suddenly the whole sarcophagus began to beat like a heart. Boom, 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 boom. And it was powerful, Lauren. I mean, it was really powerful. And now the antiquities inspector rushed across from where he'd been standing, and he was like, you could see that he was really troubled. And I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, it's not a problem. These are called beat frequencies, which I had experienced many times, in my career as an
Yeah.
acoustics engineer, but never with this kind of power. This sounded like a beating heart, literally. And so that was an amazing experience for me. And because I had been reading about the Great Pyramid as a resurrection machine, this was Dr. Bene Friedman who said that about it, by the way, that the Great Pyramid is a resurrection machine, and it's concerned with rebirth, basically, because the Egyptians were very focused on rebirth. They believed that they would be resurrected, they would be reborn. And so this idea of rebirth in relation to this beating heart of the sarcophagus really became powerful in my mind. And when I got back to the UK, I began reading a lot about rebirth in ancient Egypt and so on. Felt I needed to go back again with instrumentation, but this time I wanted to conduct a cymatics experiment. So there wasn't time in '96 to conduct a cymatics experiment.
So you were already into cymatics at that time?
Well, only in a very rudimentary way, I would say, compared with the science of cymatics today. I had been reading about Dr. Hans Jenny, the Swiss medical doctor who had been experimenting significantly with cymatics. And, I knew about Hans Jenny, and I knew to some degree about his work, but I never experimented with cymatics. As a mainstream acoustics engineer, it just doesn't come up, basically. The whole subject of cymatics is only a kind of fringe idea. The idea for me, was intriguing because although I had mapped the resonances of the sarcophagus with a conventional spectrum analyzer, that is making sound visible graphically, but it's not how sound appears. That's literally a graph of sound, and nature doesn't use graphs, so I wanted to be able to see the sound. And I had read about Hans Jenny, this, like I said, this Swiss medical doctor who'd been experimenting with cymatics. And the basic principle is very simple, that when sound imprints on a membrane, or impinges, let's say, on a membrane, it imprints a pattern of energy. This acoustic pattern is invisible. to the unaided eye. But if you sprinkle on some particulate matter, for example, like
Yeah.
sand or salt or fine powder, then it's a little bit like a fingerprint on glass. If you sprinkle on some talcum powder, of course, immediately it becomes
Detective
very
style, yeah.
visible. This is obviously the science of forensics, right?
Mm.
So it's a similar principle with cymatics. The imprint of the sound on the membrane is invisible, but if you then sprinkle on some revealing medium like sand, in this case, which is what we used in the King's Chamber in 1997, then it becomes visible. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make the sounds, these resonances
Mm.
in the sarcophagus, visible so that I could study them. What I expected to see were some circular patterns. These are usually a little bit like an Indian mandala or even a snowflake, you could say, symmetrical, usually very symmetrical, circular,
Mm.
and so on. But what happened instead of that was something absolutely astonishing. But let me backtrack a little bit, Lauren, to
Yeah.
say that having gained permission to go back in 1997 to conduct this cymatics experiment, about 3 weeks before going out to Egypt for these experiments, I injured my lower back quite badly, and I was in extreme pain. So, in fact, at one point, I thought I might not even be able to travel to Egypt because I was in so
Yeah.
much pain. Anyway, cutting this very short because I know we've got many other subjects to
Yes.
discuss here.
No, it's fascinating. Please continue.
I did manage to get myself to Egypt ultimately. Other people carried the equipment. I couldn't carry anything other than my camera. I
Mm.
was in so much pain. Anyway, I got into the pyramid. You might know that you have to stoop low initially to
Yeah.
get up into the Grand Gallery. Once you're in the Grand Gallery, you can stand up straight, and that certainly eased the pain in my lower back a little bit, being able to stand again. But initially, I was cramped over crawling up this, what they call the ascending corridor, and which is quite long and steep. And anyway, somehow managed to get myself, just by sheer grit and determination, I got myself into the Grand Gallery, gingerly, walked up the Grand Gallery, other people carrying the extremely heavy, two very, very, very heavy luggage cases full of equipment, got into the King's Chamber eventually, and then, with the help of the antiquities inspector, began to set up this experiment. So the essence of it, again, the speaker in the bottom of the sarcophagus, just as I did in the year earlier, but this time I wanted to stretch a membrane across the open top of the sarcophagus. Now, this membrane was PVC, and you probably know that the southeast corner of the pyramid of the sarcophagus is badly broken away, and so I needed to repair that. So back in the UK, I had fashioned an aluminium right angle to be able to repair that corner. I also knew in advance that one side of the sarcophagus is slightly higher than the other, so I took
Mm.
materials to be able to level it, like styrofoam, gaffer tape, all sorts of bits and pieces to be able to do a temporary repair really to the sarcophagus, because it has to be absolutely level when you're doing cymatics experiments. You can imagine if you're going to sprinkle sand or any media, any particulate matter on a membrane, it has to be level. Has to be,
Yeah.
absolutely level. Anyway, so
Would those mediums have had an effect on the experiment?
well, to some degree, I'll share that with you in a moment or two, because what then happened was you stretch the membrane across the surface.
Mm.
By the way, to give an even torsion across the whole area, we had 43 little bags of sand. This was all sand collected by other people outside the pyramid for this experiment.
Yeah.
And each of these little bags, we had weighed the sand at equal measures into each little bag
Mm.
so that there was an even torsion across the
Yeah.
whole surface. And then sprinkled more sand on the surface. This was the revealing medium. And as you probably know, sand, particularly sand in Egypt, has a very high quartz content. So a lot of these little grains of sand are actually little crystals and mini crystals, right? And this
I was going
hasn't.
to ask you about that because I saw that it was quartz sand with a high amount of quartz in it. And I thought that was like something special that you bought specifically for the
No, that's
experiment.
the way it is in Egypt. It has a very
Wow. Okay.
high quartz content, and so that it was an element of the experiment that ultimately did have an effect. And I'll tell you why in
Mm,
a moment. So the whole idea was to make visible the resonances in the sarcophagus. So I began at a very low frequency, down to 50 hertz, which was the lowest frequency that this little speaker could manage, right? It couldn't go any
mm,
lower than 50. So I started at about 50, and then the idea was to watch what happens with the sand grains. What you have to do with cymatics, Lauren, is particularly when you're working with particulate matter, as I was then, you have to look, first of all, for the little sand grains to jump. Now, the frequencies at which they might jump from the membrane can be extremely critical. So
mm.
you have a little bit of sound, quite low level sound initially, and then you alter the frequency of the sound, so either up or down, from this case from 50 hertz, until you see some sand grains beginning to jump. And then when they begin to jump, you then increase the volume, the power of the sound a little bit. And
Yeah.
then again, you tweak the frequency until you maximally see the jump, the height of the jump. And then once you see that, you know you've found a resonant frequency, in this case of the sarcophagus, and then increase the sound level, the volume of the sound significantly, which I did. And when I did that, something extraordinary happened. Instead of seeing a typical cymatic pattern, I saw emerge an ancient Egyptian hieroglyph. This is like
Crazy.
crazy. What? I had never expected to see anything like that. As I mentioned, usually very symmetrical patterns, usually like a snowflake kind of thing or a mandala. But
Yeah.
no, this was a hieroglyph. And so the antiquities inspector who saw this, he saw, because this was quite a large hieroglyph, and it was in the middle of the sarcophagus, and it was snaking. It wasn't static, it was dynamic, like a snake. It was
Mm.
writhing like a snake. And this was the Jed pillar, as they call it, DJED, Jed pillar of the god Osiris. Excuse me. So this was really significant icon of ancient Egypt. And
Yeah.
now the antiquities inspector rushed over from where he had been standing, filing his nails, looking across at me, and probably thinking this Englishman's, not quite right in the head. I don't know what he was thinking, because he certainly had a bored expression on his face. But now he rushed across from where he was standing, and he said, "How you do that? How you do that?" And he was
Yeah.
very excited, as I was, seeing this hieroglyph. I mean, who wouldn't be under those circumstances? And so now he wanted to help. Before he was,
Yeah.
obviously bored, but now he's like, "How can I help you? What can I do?" He wanted to be engaged now with the experiment, and so we became a little team. And I had taken a small brush and a little shovel to be able to scrape the sand off.
Mm.
So he would be, brushing the sand off and collecting the sand, and then I would sprinkle more sand on from a cappuccino chocolate shaker, is what I had
Love that.
taken to be able to do this. Sprinkle the sand, more sand evenly over the whole surface, and then change the frequency on the oscillator. So, and by the way, I took a photograph, obviously,
I've seen it. Yeah.
yeah, you've seen that.
It's
And then I took a
amazing.
photograph, and then change the frequency, and then
Yeah.
what happened? And again, another hieroglyph emerged, and another. And so there was a whole series of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, one after the other. But in between these hieroglyphs, sometimes instead of a hieroglyph, there would be a very strange pattern that I've come to call a coral sea like image. Very strange shapes, otherworldly kind of shapes. And then suddenly something coherent, another hieroglyph would emerge. and so on. And I took a lot of photographs that day. And
Yeah.
this was all a film camera, by the way, Lauren, because in those days, it was the very, very early days of digital photography.
Yeah.
And, a high definition photo in those days would be like 200 kilobytes. I'm not kidding,
Mm,
kilobytes. So I just thought, no, I'm not going to take a digital camera. I'll take a photo, film camera. But when all these amazing images occurred, I was just praying basically that this would be developed, this film would be developed. And it was, it was not a problem at all. Anyway, so then what happened was about 20 minutes into this astonishing experiment, again, looking for jumping sand grains, I suddenly
yeah.
realized that there was no pain in my lower back. The pain had completely vanished. And in that moment, the thought that went through my mind was that my bloodstream must be flowing with endorphins, natural opioids, because I was so
Yeah.
excited. And so that was a natural thought, I think, to have. And I still remember it very clearly to this day, after, well, almost 30 years ago now, that event occurred. No pain in my lower back. But remembering I'd had severe
Mm,
pain for 3 weeks up to this point. So I thought, wow, this is really amazing. But in the moment, I couldn't really focus my thoughts on that. But I did think that at least when I get back outside the pyramid, this pain's going to come back with a vengeance. But it never did come back. And that really got my attention. So
yeah.
that day, in summary, two events which were life changing. The fact that the Cymatics experiment had been so phenomenally successful, and then the other aspect that my back had been seemingly miraculously healed within only 20 minutes of making sound, when no amount of
Mm,
analgesics or visits to a physiotherapist, because I had been to a
mm,
physio a couple of times as well, nothing had really touched that pain. But now, only 20 minutes of sound and no pain. So that really did get
fascinating.
my attention. And then I thought also, if we can make visible hieroglyphs, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs on an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus, what else can we do with this
Yeah.
cymatic science? And so what happened then was when we got back to the UK, again, no pain, still no pain in my lower back. I began to wind up my business, which was it actually took 2 years ultimately to be able to wind up, sell that business on to
Yeah.
other people, other operators. And I then changed my career path to become the scientist, which as a young man, I had, wanted to be. And
Mm,
so now, all of these years later, I've studied cymatic science in depth, of course. I have invented the Cymascope instrument, which, by the way, I have a, a portable model behind me, which I'll show you very briefly.
yes. I would love to, before we get into the actual invention, I would love to talk about the basics of cymatics. Like people who have no idea, you know, how does it work?
Well, I mentioned very briefly earlier that it concerns making sound visible, excuse me, by sprinkling sand on a membrane, or indeed you can use fluids, which ultimately, I came to use in the Cymascope instrument because
Mm,
I very soon realized that sand or any kind of particulate matter on a membrane is obviously two-dimensional. Before we get any more detail into cymatic technology, let me first describe what sound is, because I think a lot of people get a little bit confused about sound from the perspective that this term sound wave is in general use in the population. You're taught about sound as a wave. You're taught this term sound wave when you're at school, in science class, or at college or at university. Still, all scientists today
yeah.
refer to sound waves. They also refer to light waves, right?
Mm,
And the truth, the reality of the situation is that there's literally is no wave, no sound wave wiggling its way through the air. If you talk to someone about sound waves, if you say to someone, what is the shape of sound? They will say, well, it's a wave. And then you say, okay, well, show me that wave coming out of your mouth right now as you're
Yeah.
talking. And they will do this. They'll show you literally a wiggle in the
Yeah,
air.
I know the diagrams from school.
Yeah. So that's what they will show you, because that's where we have been. That's what we've been taught,
Yeah.
as a school, at school or college or university even, right? But the reality is completely different. In reality, what's coming out of my mouth and a little bit out of my nose right now is a bubble of sound. Sound propagates, audible sound propagates spherically. So why am I saying audible? Well, because the shape of sound is actually largely referenced to the frequency. So in other words, if the
Mm.
frequency rises very high, then the shape of sound will no longer be a sphere, a bubble of sound. It will be much, much flattened as the frequency rises. But when I say about audibility, I'm talking now about all the frequencies that we can hear or that we can make vocally. All of those types of sounds are spherical. They're perfectly or almost perfectly spherical, not necessarily absolutely perfectly spherical.
Mm.
So you might want to use the word spheroidal if we're going to be really careful in our choice of language here, but almost like a bubble anyway, a bubble of sound, let's say. And that
Yeah.
bubble of sound that's leaving my mouth now and a little bit out of my nose, that bubble is oscillating in and out, pulsating in and out with all of the frequencies, all of the vibrations of my vocal folds. So as my voice is going up and down, so these frequencies are now altering the rate at which this bubble is expanding and contracting, right? So that modulation of the bubble is the sound. That
Mm.
pulsation, that's the sound. And if we graph that, if we look at a graph of that energy, then, an XY graph, we will see what looks like a wave. But
Yeah.
remember, that is a graph. It's not the actual shape of
Yeah, it's
sound.
2D.
So that's important to know. Now, this bubble of sound, when it impinges upon any membrane, it literally imprints a cymatic pattern on that membrane. So let's talk, for example, now about sound in relation to every cell in your body,
Mm.
because every cell in your body has a membrane. Obviously, they're microscopic in scale, they're really very small. In fact, even the largest type of cell is extremely difficult to see with the unaided eye. Like, for example, a macrophage, which is one of the class of white blood cells. If you have a lot of macrophages, on a petri dish, for example, if
Yeah.
you really got very, very sharp eyesight, you might be able to see them. But that's the
Mm.
very largest type of cell. All other types of cells, you would never see them with the unaided eye. You need a microscope, basically. But nevertheless, all of these different types of cells have a membrane that encloses the cytoplasm of the cell. And the principle with cymatics is regardless of scale. It doesn't matter whether the membrane we're talking about is in the microscopic realm, or another realm that we can talk about very briefly is the
Yeah.
realm of galaxies. There's a mainstream model of cosmology that says that the most potent force in the universe was sound in the first 370,000 years or so of
Mm.
expansion of the Big Bang. Sound was the most potent force and organized what we now see as groups of galaxies with huge voids between. This organization of matter in the universe, according to this mainstream model, is because of sound. And then also, if you think of the planet Saturn, if you look at it, if you go and look on a browser, just put in giant hexagon on Saturn, you will see what is a hexagon, a perfect hexagon on the North Pole of the planet
Wow.
Saturn. So
I'll have to
large,
check that out.
please do check it out. So large it could swallow 3 Earths. That's how big it is, right?
Crazy.
The
Why do
scale.
they think that's there?
Well, it's there because there's a storm, a circular storm, which is going very, very fast, about
Right.
1,000 miles an hour around the periphery of this hexagon, and it's creating low frequency sound. Now, in this case, I already mentioned cymatics can be revealed through powder or other particulate matter on a membrane. I also talked very briefly about liquids. I'm going to get into liquids more
Mm.
soon. But in addition to making sound visible with particulate matter or with liquids, you can also make it visible with gases. And in the case of the planet Saturn, that's exactly what we see. We see actual gases. In fact, on Earth, there are certain conditions where the clouds that we see have been organized cymatically by sound. And I've been teaching this actually in recent courses, and I think so many people are really fascinated by this because you go outside and look at the clouds
You can see
sometimes,
it.
and you see beautiful striations in the clouds, right, where groups of clouds are beautifully organized, by specific distances. And this is sound that is actually, it could be an event thousands of miles away that's causing this locally because because the very long so-called wavelengths of sound actually can organize, in this case, water vapor, which is what clouds
Yeah.
are,
So
into
would that be like thunder from far away?
yeah, it could be thousands of miles away, or it could be an avalanche, or an earthquake.
Wow.
There are
Oh.
all of these methods of, all of these natural sound producing means can cause clouds to organize into great, well, obviously geometric patterns and so on. So it's fascinating. It's a fascinating
Oh.
new science. But in terms of my early work with inventing the Cymascope instrument, I very quickly realized that particulate matter was not the way to go because it's limited in its ability to show detail. And so I began
Yeah.
to experiment with liquids. And
Oh.
Hans Jenny had done a little bit with liquids, very little actually. But now I experimented a lot with liquids. And the new Cymascope instruments all use pure water, actually. And pure water was the very, very best liquid for revealing sound. And it's one of the reasons for that is the purity. So this is not ordinary water in the sense of, out of a tap or whatever. This is medical grade water, which what we mean by that is it's extremely pure. So this is triple distilled water. It's the kind of water that you could inject into a vein, if you wanted to, if you
Mm.
needed to medically. That's the kind of water we're referring to. And the reason for this is because you don't want any solutes, any suspended particles in the water, even though they might be microscopic. They would affect the result when sound enters into the water. So this water that I'm referring to is simply pure H2O. There's nothing
Yeah. There's
suspended
no
in it,
minerals, nothing else in there.
nothing at all, no. And so what happens is when sound enters into water, you have to kind of visualize the trillions and trillions of water molecules all just jostling around. And this is called Brownian motion. Uh, and it just simply means that the heat in the water, the electromagnetic radiation in that water, at whatever temperature that water is, we're assuming it's liquid
Mm.
water, of course, is causing the water molecules to just jostle around. They're kind of doing a little jitterbug dance, but they're all entirely random, right? But as soon as sound enters into the water, that random movement completely disappears and is replaced with organization, beautiful organization. So now, as soon as sound enters into water, the water molecules become beautifully organized. And if you know exactly how to achieve this result of cymatic imagery, then what happens is, at a very particular critical threshold, a beautiful cymatic pattern is seen on the surface of the water. However, what's really important to know here is that that pattern is not simply a surface phenomenon. Yes, you see it on the surface of the
Yeah.
water, and you can photograph it, of course, either with still or video camera, but that organization is going right throughout the whole depth of the water. Why am I saying this is important? Well, now if you think about your body as a body of water, your almost all the molecules in your body are water, right? So when you are immersed in a sonic environment, which by the way is always, you on this earth, you can't escape sound. There's always sound. Those sounds actually organize the water molecules not only on the surface membranes of all of the cells in your body, but also all of the visceral waters, all of the waters in your body become organized. And this is, an extremely important aspect of
Mm,
cymatic science.
amazing. Yeah, I guess that also ties into a couple of the experiments I was really looking forward to talking to you about with the red blood cells study that you did with this. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to, Lauren. Well, this is going back now to really getting to the root of how my lower back was healed all those years ago in the Great Pyramid. And work that I conducted, experiments that I conducted with Professor Sungchul G of Rutgers University. Professor G and I worked together to investigate the properties of music in particular on the longevity of red blood cells. That was the general principle of the experiments that we were conducting. I'd had this idea many, many years ago. Really, it was inspired by Pythagoras of Samos. You probably know that he was the guy who said that music could be used in place of medicine. But I came to realize that, I mean, it's a famous quote, but I came to
Yeah.
realize that it hadn't really been tested with any scientific rigor. And so I designed this very simple experiment using human blood. And the idea was to test what's called the viability of human blood in the case of red blood cells. This is the ratio of dead red blood cells to living red blood cells. So you have to
Mm,
know that in your body right now, in your vascular system, there are countless trillions of red blood cells that are alive and well and doing their job, which is to essentially to bring oxygen to all the tissues in your body. But there will also be countless trillions that are medically old, what's classed as medically old. This means that they're not dead, but that they're not doing very well. They've reached the limit of their lifespan, and ultimately they will die and they will be mopped up. So when we receive blood here in the lab from the supplier, this blood will have been taken from, say, the arm of a blood donor just the day before, right?
mm,
And when that person is sitting there and waiting for the phlebotomist to, take the blood, that person is breathing, of course, and they take a breath, they take this last breath, right? And then the phlebotomist takes their blood. Why I'm mentioning this is because every breath that you take causes oxygen to be in the gas exchanging process in your lungs to enter into your bloodstream. So the alveoli, these little protrusions in your lungs, are where this gas exchange takes place. So the air that
mm,
you're breathing, which contains obviously oxygen, those oxygen molecules go through the alveoli and into your bloodstream, and so now you can visualize oxygen in your bloodstream, and also obviously carbon dioxide and nitrogen is expelled with every breath. We know this. But I'm referring now to the fact that these oxygen molecules have now gone through the alveoli and are now in your bloodstream. So your bloodstream is flowing with oxygen right? And this phlebotomist person took the blood of this donor
Yeah.
just after they'd taken a breath. So now you get the idea that this blood that's been taken has got masses of dissolved oxygen in it. Okay.
Mm.
But when it's received here, in our case, we receive it in test tubes, it's very, very dark red. And this should have been a clue, actually, initially. It wasn't because we didn't realize this process initially. But the fact is that this blood, when it arrives, is very, very dark red. It's like a kind of dark maroon color, I would call it. So we started doing our experiments with music. And the idea was to test with an automatic cell counter how many red blood cells are alive and well and how many are dead, right? And the cell counter does this very easily because using what's termed an trypan blue assay, which essentially is a kind of blue stain. And this blue stain that you mix with the blood sample can penetrate any dead red blood cell. It can
Yeah.
also penetrate any old red blood cell because with an old red blood cell, instead of the red blood cell having that beautiful dimple shape that we all know and love, no, this old red blood cells, the membrane is looking very in disarray. It's breaking up, in other words. And this allows the stain to penetrate. Whereas with a healthy red blood cell, the stain cannot penetrate that membrane. And so this is the simple method by which the automatic cell counter can spot really easily which ones are dead or old and which ones are alive and well. And so we do a count with the blood from the test tube, and we make a note of that. And then we put one of the test tubes, we actually decant the blood into two test tubes. One test tube goes into an incubator in the lab here with a small speaker in it. And the
Yep.
other test tube goes into the Faraday cage in the lab, which is an electromagnetically screened little room. You can walk into it. It's a small room. You shut the door, and when that door's closed, in there it's extremely quiet, but also electromagnetically screened. So no electromagnetism, no radio, no cell phones, no
Yep.
television transmissions, nothing can get in there basically. And in the Faraday cage, we have another incubator. So that blood is sitting nice and warm in this little incubator, but in a very quiet and controlled environment. And then the other blood, of course, is receiving music. We tried
Mm.
many different genres of music, Lauren. We tried obviously rock music, pop music of very different genres, classical music, right? And what we found was every genre of music that we tried really increased the viability, this ratio of dead to living red blood cells.
I wish you had tried some Tibetan bowls or
Oh
some
yeah, well,
traditional sound
I
healing
conducted
instruments.
experiments with Tibetan bowls, and again,
You
it's a
have?
oh yes, and get really excellent results with Tibetan bowls and crystal bowls. But
Wow.
this change in viability is not
Mm.
about it's not about bringing dead red blood cells, back to life. You can't do that. Once
Mm.
a cell is dead, it's dead. But what you can do, it turns out, we now know from these experiments, that if a red blood cell has lost its integrity, lost its membrane integrity, and it, in the body would be very soon mopped up and replaced, what we found was that in these experiments, old red blood cells can be made new again. You can literally regenerate old red blood cells with sound frequencies. And this was a revelation to us. I mean, we had
Mm.
hoped that we would see some kind of an effect, but what
Yeah.
we did see was really quite significant. I mean, even up to 20% increase in viability with some
Oh.
types of music. What was really strange, and this was a great clue that we learned a lot from, was that classical music provided the very poorest results, actually. And this was,
Yeah. That's the opposite to what I'm sure many people would think.
it is, because
Yeah.
intuitively we thought classical music would provide the best result, but no, it didn't.
Yeah.
Classical music provided, you know, averaged around 10 or 12% increase, which was still
Mm.
pretty good. But popular music and rock music, we were talking 15 or anything up to 20% increase in the viability. So this was really, quite a significant result. And we were puzzled by it. And how we ended up figuring out the actual mechanism was really very simple indeed. And it comes back to this color of the blood. So what we did was, we realized that it might be the low frequencies. This was the difference between classical music and all forms of popular music is mainly the bass register. In classical music, you have very little bass energy.
Mm.
Some pieces of classical music that do have bass energy, but very few, like the organ concertos, obviously Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture and so on with the cannons. But most classical music is mid-range and upper frequencies, whereas most popular music usually has a throbbing, pulsating bass beat. And so we came to realize that that might be the reason, for this difference between classical music and popular music. And so what we ended up doing was to inject whole human blood into the Cymascope instrument. Why? Because the Cymascope instrument had a low frequency response that starts at 3 hertz, extremely low subaudible frequency. And so we thought, okay, let's put human blood into the Cymascope and then inject a sound into it and see what happens. And we did that. Immediately, we saw a cymatic pattern, which was, we expected to see, like what I was just talking about on the surface of the planet, on the north pole of the planet Saturn, a hexagonal pattern, right? And this is a reference to this business of scale, in cymatics. It just doesn't matter whether you're talking about the planet Saturn, the Cymascope instrument, or the surface of a living cell. You can have cymatic patterns at all scales. But here we saw this great beauty emerge as a hexagonal pattern. But then when you remove the sound energy, the water molecules, or in the case of the blood, we thought should go back to order, or disorder, chaos
Mm.
again, right? That's normal. But
So is it
no,
kind of like a healing imprint is made?
it was a healing imprint, and we'll, get into the reasons for that, because what actually was happening was that the pressure of the low frequency sound, bearing in mind that sound is a pressure, right? That's what sound is. It's a pressure. And the pressure of the low frequencies, in this case, because we were using very low frequency, that we were using 44 hertz, actually, it was very low. It's audible, but it's
Yeah.
very low frequency. What was happening was that pressure was causing the dissolved oxygen that I referred to earlier,
Hmm.
that dissolved oxygen now to bind to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, right? Literally a binding mechanism. And so what then happened was, of course, that binding caused a hexagonal pattern to emerge that is semi-permanent. Remove the sound, this low frequency sound, and the pattern just remained in the blood, this bright scarlet, not dark maroon anymore. And this was an astonishing moment. This was a major discovery, basically, because it turned out that sound has this ability to cause oxygen to bind to
Mm.
hemoglobin. And that was the clue, not only to why the music, in this case, mainly popular music, was causing the regeneration of old red blood cells, because the red blood cells were being given oxygen that they didn't have earlier. And this oxygen is able to help the proteins in their normal repair mechanisms. And this is why within only 20 minutes, the sufficient repair has occurred to reject the trypan blue stain. So now the idea that that these old red blood cells were being regenerated simply because of the additional oxygen that they were going to be receiving, that they did receive from the low frequency content of the music. And this is really an amazing that will have in the future significant implication for medical science, because here is validation that music in particular can regenerate old red blood cells. And so it is a significant finding. So much as we're just about now actually very close, literally within a few weeks of sending um, peer our article for peer review to a biology journal. And once that is published, I think there'll be a lot of excitement in the world, even even into mainstream medicine. I think where this idea of music as a therapy is starting to become interesting. There's a new clinical term, which is music medicine. Now, that's an important term because it's showing in mainstream medicine that music has therapeutic qualities.
Yeah.
Now, it's been known, Lauren, for a long time. Well, I'm saying now a long time, going back to the 1950s,
Mm.
been known that music therapy is a powerful form of therapy where you have a credentialed music therapist working with a patient, selecting music, and there's quite a significant degree of talk therapy involved as well. So it's a kind of psychoanalytical form of therapy, but supported by music. So that's been known for a long time. But music medicine, this new clinical term, you're not working with a music therapist. It's simply saying that music has therapeutic qualities even without the intervention of a therapist. So I think that's a really exciting, direction for mainstream medicine. And certainly I think when our paper is published, it will cause, significant waves, as it were, in mainstream, because it's validating one of the many biological mechanisms which music can support healing in the body.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's had like a direct experience with sound healing, you can walk out of there and you really feel like something's shifted. And so to have a more scientific framework to look at is, for me, it's really exciting. And more evidence of the power of sound is coming out now. I'm seeing there's a study from, I think it was RMIT, where they used high frequencies on stem cells to kind of stimulate them to shift into bone cells. I think that was like last year. But yeah, for me, I can't wait to see where this goes.
But there are, the stem cell therapy is very important. But there are other mechanisms that we could mention right now. You were talking earlier about Tibetan bowls. They have
Yeah,
a very beautiful soundscape. Thousands of frequencies are created. Other forms of instrument like the gong, for example, another wonderful instrument, again has thousands of frequencies. Why this is important, many people now these days are experiencing gong baths and Tibetan
yeah,
bowl baths, where those of your viewers and listeners, if you've never experienced that, I definitely would encourage you to try it, because it is a beautiful experience. Typically, you would lie on the floor. You would have either a gong master or a Tibetan bowl master who is playing these instruments for you, and your body is going to be soaking up all of these thousands of frequencies. Now, how does this work from a
yeah,
biological viewpoint? Well, there are several different mechanisms involved. One we've already just touched on, actually, which is the low frequency content of, say, a gong or a Tibetan bowl. If it's a large Tibetan bowl, particularly, the low frequency content literally enters into your body because low frequencies penetrate your tissues very efficiently. Those low frequencies cause more oxygen to be bound to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. So that's one mechanism. So in other words, you're going to get more oxygen. And of course, if
yeah,
you have more oxygen is literally the key healing molecule in your whole body. So that's obviously a great benefit that you're going to receive straight away. One of the other benefits is nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is another very important molecule in your body. One of the benefits of nitric oxide is vasodilation, which basically means that your blood vessels, all of your blood vessels, will dilate a little. That causes more improvement in transport system of your blood. Therefore, again, more oxygen will be received by your
Mm,
tissues if you have a healthy degree of nitric oxide flowing in your bloodstream, right? So where does this come from with the Tibetan bowls or the gongs or whatever? Well, nitric oxide is created in the paranasal sinus cavities primarily, and they have resonant frequencies. You know, we talked about resonance earlier, and we
yeah.
talked about the fact that resonance means a slight amount of movement of a surface, say. Well, in the case of the paranasal sinus cavities, they do move a little bit under the influence of high frequency sound. And here,
Mm,
when I say high, I'm referring here to about between 1000 hertz and 2000 hertz, which are pretty high frequencies, and they come from Tibetan bowls and gongs beautifully, actually. So as you're
mm,
lying there soaking up these frequencies, you can visualize in your paranasal sinus cavities copious amounts of nitric oxide being produced. Also, your lungs produce nitric oxide to some degree, but with much lower frequencies, more like between 100 and 150 hertz. But again, Tibetan bowls, gongs, and other crystal bowls and so on produce these low frequencies. So you're going to get lots of nitric oxide while you're lying there. Now, another mechanism that we could talk about here
mm,
is what's called the G phase of the cell cycle. You should know that some cells, if they're traumatized by whatever reason, it could be too high a toxic load in your body or some form of pathogen that has caused some cells in your body to be traumatized, or it could be
mm,
physical trauma. Whatever the reason, system of cells in your body can literally go to sleep. This is a sleep phase that's called the G phase of the cell cycle. Now, you can imagine the whole of your body as being a very complex system of interrelated biofields, incredibly complex. And so any one part of that system that goes offline causes an imbalance in the general homeostasis of your body. And so you might feel just not very well, or you might feel significantly ill. And this is because of an imbalance. Some system of your body has gone offline. It's literally asleep. So,
yeah.
how can a Tibetan bowl or how can a gong reawaken those sleeping cells and bring them back online? And it happens simply because all the cells in your body actually do sing, if we can use that term poetically,
Mm,
sing a song. And this was a discovery made by Professor James Jimzewski at UCLA in 2002. He used, for the first time, was able to listen in to the sounds of cells or the song of cells
yeah.
using what is termed an atomic force microscope. So atomic force microscopy is the system that he used to listen in to the sound of cells for the first time. And it turns out that every type of cell has its own unique song. But when cells go into the G0 phase, into the sleeping phase, they stop singing. So they're literally now quiet. And this is how it's possible for the frequencies of a gong or a Tibetan bowl or a crystal bowl to
Yeah.
reawaken those sleeping cells and bring them back online again. And it happens simply because these frequencies, the song of the cell, the song of the cell will be comprised of many different frequencies. And unfortunately, no one has yet identified. Jim Zuski stopped his work many years ago, so we don't yet have the knowledge to be able to identify the frequencies that each cell sings. But what we can do is we can immerse those cells in a very wide soundscape, a wide array of frequencies, such as from Tibetan bowls, gongs, crystal bowls, and so on. And when we do that, those frequencies penetrate the body, and those cells that are asleep can be stimulated. In other words, these frequencies act as a catalyst to reawaken. It's like a form of sonic nutrition, is really what it is. It's simply energy that the cell can receive to reawaken it. And when that happens, no doubt, after you've had this Tibetan bowl bath or gong bath, you're going to get up feeling wonderful. You're going to be energized because you've got more oxygen in your body because of the mechanism I've described. Right. And now also any sleeping cells have been reawakened. So no wonder people come out from these these gong baths and so on feeling so wonderful.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I know sometimes I leave and I feel very like high and my energy is up. But at other times after a gong bath or a sound bath, I feel like I'm, half asleep. Maybe I fall into a deep, deep sleep in that experience.
Now we should mention just before we have to leave here that the
Mm,
whole point of vagal stimulation is to, yes, improve vagal tone, which is important because, as I said earlier, your vagus system innervates, literally connects all of the major organs in your body. But
yeah.
also, from a therapeutic viewpoint, it's extremely important because it's been shown by these many groups of medical researchers that if you have optimal vagal stimulation, you can reverse chronic inflammation in the body. So
Mm,
now chronic inflammation is something that people, many millions of people all over the world suffer from. Many different diseases like conditions like fibromyalgia, for example. In fact, all cancers, the chronic inflammation is a precursor to cancer. So if you've got chronic inflammation in your body and you don't do anything about it, ultimately you probably will succumb to a cancer. And so it's very important to know that optimal vagal stimulation can reverse chronic inflammation in the body and can help many other medical conditions of the heart, even diabetes type 2 can be reversed by optimal vagal stimulation. And there's another extremely important result which I've been reading about, which is that optimal vagal stimulation, if you have cancer, it will improve your prognosis up to 50%, which is
wow.
remarkable. So, and there are millions of people suffering with cancers all over the world. So, if they were listening to beautiful music from this list via high quality headphones, then their prognosis could improve by up to 50%. And that is really quite significant. And one other thing I'd like to share just before, because I am going to have to go in a couple of minutes,
Yes, no
but
worries.
I'd really like to mention the Cymascope app, which you see
Yes,
here.
please do.
In fact, all of the time that we've been chatting today, Lauren, I've had this app running beside me here. And this app, what it's doing right now, it's making my voice visible. And if you talk, it will make your voice visible as it comes out of the speakers of my computer here. And what it's doing is it has what's termed a fast Fourier transform analyzer working in the background. And it's literally analyzing the frequencies in my voice in real time, and then it's putting the cymatic pattern of my voice energy up on the screen within a fraction of a second. So you're seeing all these beautiful images coming up on the screen right now. But one of the most important aspects of this app, you can play, by the way, you can play the keyboard
Yeah.
on the app as well. But one of the most important aspects of the app that I'd like to mention before closing is simply this button here. If I press this button here, you'll see it has a collection of articles, videos, and so on. I'm really excited about it, Lauren, because this app, it's only $12 to buy. But when you buy it, if you go into that articles section where you find articles on frequency medicine, music medicine, sound therapy, and so on, there are articles already on there that are like worth $40. But that repository of knowledge is going to be increased in the coming months. We can, as the app builder, add new articles, as time goes on. So one day you'll get up and you'll open the app and there will be a new article for you to read on frequency medicine, for example. And so I'm
Fantastic.
really excited about it. It's a way to share knowledge with the world and to spread this good knowledge of music medicine, frequency medicine, and so on. So I'm so happy that we've been able to have this conversation today, Lauren. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Yes, I've got the app and I had such a great time using it. I can't wait to get back to my Tibetan bowls and see what the pictures look like from each different bowl. So
Wonderful. And it's available on the Apple platform and also on the Android platform. So if you go to the Google Play Store and just look up Cymascope, CYMA, and then scope like microscope, Cymascope app, you'll find it, and yeah, you'll have great fun with it.
where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you're doing? I know you've got cymascope.com, you've got the Cymascope app, but where else can people reach you?
Well, if you go to the Cymascope.com research site, you'll find a button there on that main homepage for the Cymascope shops. The Cymascope shop is called soundmadevisible.com. And there
Yeah,
we have some really great products that you can browse. And all of any purchase that you make from Sound Made Visible support our research. So we're all, completely self-funded. We also have a really great little array of videos and so on YouTube. So if you simply look up Cymascope on YouTube, you will find a lot of my presentations and talks and so on, and you'll be able to soak up new knowledge that way as well.
fantastic. Thank you so much, John.
Been a great pleasure, Lauren. Many thanks. Many blessings.